Добрий день, шановні глядачі! Вітаємо вас на телепрограмі Альберта Контакт. Я Василь Яворський. Цього місяця Канадський інститут українських студій в Альбертському університеті влаштував окремі представлення двох нових книжок Perogies and Politics і My Final Territory. Сьогодні ми пропонуємо вам подивитись ці представлення, починаючи з представленням книги Рhonda Hinther Perogies and Politics. Представлення нової книги Рhonda Hinther Perogies and Politics відбулося в доречному місці, в будинку Товариства Об'єднаних Українських Канадців. Перед презентацією присутні мали нагоду придбати собі копію книги. Авторка Рhonda Hinther підписували продані книги та спілкувалася з гостями. Товариство Об'єднаних Українських Канадців цього року відзначило дуже велику річницю – 100 років від його заснування. Директор Канадського інституту українських студій Ярослав Балан представив головного промовця і авторку книги Рhondu Hinther.
This event is historic. This is the first time we've held one in this hall. It won't be the last. And we're very glad that you, for the turnout, and I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting talk that Rhonda is going to give. I've got to know best, of course, when she was putting together her book that she co-edited with Jim Wachuruk, Ukrainian Canadians, Reimagining Ukrainian Canadians, History, Politics, and Identity. And it's a very important book, a collection of essays by various scholars. And it came out by the University of Toronto Press in 2011. She is now co-editing with Jim another collection on the history of the internment in Canada, and as part of that there's going to be a big conference coming up next year.
Well, that's the Winnipeg General Strike Conference,
From the
but
General
we'll be
Strike,
talking about the book there for sure.
They'll be talking about that as well. Rhonda teaches at the Brandon University. She's a professor of history there, and this is her first authored book, not her last, I hope.
Рhonda Hinther розповіла всім присутнім про свої дослідження стосовно лівих політичних сил українців у Канаді. Це була головна тема її книжки.
So this book is about leftist or progressive Ukrainians, a diverse group of individuals who created one of the most dynamic working class movements in 20th century Canada. The founding generation belonged to the large wave of over 170,000 Ukrainians, immigrants from Bukovina and Galicia who entered Canada during the period 1891 to 1914. They came as a part of the massive influx of immigrants the Canadian federal government recruited during that time to settle the Canadian prairies or to serve as cheap labor in the expanding resource sector. Additional support came from the 70,000 Ukrainians admitted into Canada during the wars. The Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association galvanized the efforts of these immigrants, radicals, and their offspring into a unified and influential secular national movement. Well, I'm Ukrainian on my mom's side. My family came over from the old country in 1910, so they've been here a long time. On my father's side, I'm Volga Deutsch and Polish Jewish, so definitely mixed backgrounds. I came to this project partly because of my interest in knowing more about Ukrainian Canadian history, but also because I'm a labor historian and I found the social justice activism of this community to be compelling. This book's aim is to explore the 20th century history of the Ukrainian Left in Canada and its various organizations, so the ULFTA, the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, its various business offshoots, like the People's Co-op, the Workers' Benevolent Association, Globe Tours, Ukrainsky Kniha, and others, as a political and cultural movement and community. It's written from the standpoint of the women, men, and children who formed and fostered this movement. Especially concerned with change over time, the project considers how particular events and social, economic, and political forces in the past affected these activists, and how they in turn influenced, processed, and responded to these experiences. Part of my motivation for writing this book, for doing this research, was to hopefully get out a more nuanced portrayal of Ukrainian leftists in Canada. I think that in some cases the way that they've been remembered or thought of has been somewhat two-dimensional. And so my hope is that this book gets at the richness of that experience, the importance of that activism, and the various roles that women, men, and children played in forming and fostering the movement. The Ukrainian Left community attracted countless members and supporters, young and old, female and male, immigrant and Canadian born, through a range of social, cultural, and political activities that combine elements of the Canadian working class experience and components of traditional Ukrainian culture. For these activists, politics and culture were inextricably linked. These Ukrainian leftists focused their energies on two major priorities: improving the circumstances of workers and farmers in Canada and around the world, and preserving and expressing Ukrainian cultural traditions in their adopted Canadian homeland. At times, certain constituencies of this community valued and supported these priorities differently. Nonetheless, no matter how or when they were manifest, these concerns were reflective of both adaptation and resistance the immigrant generation and their children employed to adjust to and improve their personal and community circumstances, as well as negotiate personally and collectively a sense of Ukrainianness and later Ukrainian Canadianness. While the movement's founders' goals have only been met to some degree, and not always in the forms they envisioned, the movement as a whole has had a tremendous and profound effect on those who came to embrace the Ukrainian labor temples as second homes. As such, studying the Ukrainian left enriches our understanding of the various ways to be Ukrainian in Canada's past. It likewise extends our knowledge of Canadian working class immigrant life generally and its related political, social, and cultural components, lending nuance to our understanding of the broader Canadian left.
А після презентації пані Гінтер відповіла на цілий ряд питань, які задавали присутні.
The main thrust, I think, of the AUC and the labor temples, etc., was social justice, striving for social justice. And yet, there were others who strove for social justice also and did not come under the control and influence of Moscow. So do you think that the Ukrainian left would have been more successful in achieving greater results and progress towards social justice by either remaining independent or aligning themselves with someone like the CCF or the New Democrats, instead of coming under the influence and perhaps control of Moscow?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to say. I think that part of the significance of this organization is the fact that those involved with it were so bold and were willing to get out there and express this kind of challenge, express this kind of alternative worldview, way of life to capitalist democracies, to what was going on in Canada and elsewhere. And by doing that, although for many people in Canada they represented a kind of extreme, it certainly put a lot of pressure on, and they were loud voices that helped to contribute to many of the social justice benefits that we enjoy today. Certainly we see this reflected in Communist Party history as well, where certain points in time where the Communist Party and other socialist organizations, far left organizations, were able to exert enough pressure that it forced neoliberal regimes, political parties to take notice and to begin integrating some of their what they were pushing for into those more mainstream party platforms. We see this certainly during World War II with what Mackenzie King's government began bringing in terms of social programs, especially when you see the power and support of the Communist Party really rising later on in the war. So seeing that challenge, some of those programs were co-opted by those mainstream political parties, bringing in social change, social justice initiatives that may not otherwise have been realized had folks like the ULFTAers and others not been willing to put themselves out there at great risk.
Це все цікаво послухати, тому що в загальній громаді ми не мали зв'язків тут з українськими так званими комуністами. І цікаво більше довідатися про них, за що вони боролися. І, очевидно, вони говорять, що були в обороні суспільної справедливості. І цікаво трохи більше дізнатися про них. Так що був цікавий вечір, і я думаю, що ті, що тут були, то скористали з того.
So I don't understand, but my question is about the relationship between these other ethnic communities that were the building blocks of the left in Canada. What was the relationship between the AUC and the Jews, AUC and the Poles? Because there also the Poles were there as well, the Finns. Were there instances of friction? I mean, were there instances of where in the Ukrainian left made some anti-Semitic comments or anything like that? Did you find anything on those relationships? The Poles, that's another good one because, of course, what was going on in Western Ukraine in the interwar period was a very fraught time.
Probably, if I were to write this book today, I would write a book that was more focused on the so-called ethnic left more generally, one that looked at the Finns, the Jews, the Poles, Ukrainians, all of them together, and what this movement looked like. Esther Reiter has written a fantastic book on the Jewish left in Canada. Came out last year, and that's one that's really worth looking at to get at some of these questions. And where I'm really seeing these relationships coming out, seeing how close they are, is in the current work that I'm doing on the internment of leftists during World War II in Canada. So those who were, many of whom were very active leaders in either the Communist Party, the various ethnic hall socialist organizations, trade unions. So there were over 100 people, mostly men, who were arrested and interned. But you really see how closely integrated those so-called ethnic leftists were as a result of their involvement in the socialist movement. So
I joined the organization sometime in the 80s, and I remember it was always more than top-heavy with men, almost exclusively male. And, during the period that it was formed, that pre-war period, women had a really hard time of it. They were the stalwarts who kept the home going, basically, without them, Johnny MacDonald's and Laurier's national policy wouldn't have happened. They really kept it going. So, I found it rather surprising that we in this organization weren't successful in tackling that issue more than we have, given that we claim to have a special place when it comes to tackling social and political issues like that.
Particularly in the interwar chapter on women, talking about the experiences of women and how important women were to forwarding the organization, forwarding the movement, the role they played in a broad sense in the organization, the many roles that they took on, but also the way in which their contributions were often marginalized or discounted, particularly by some of the male leaders. And there's a patriarchal culture within the organization, certainly within the Ukrainian community more broadly, at that time, that really contributed and reinforced that kind of a culture for women. It's changed somewhat in the post-war period, but and certainly many of the women that I interviewed for the project talked about how their activism shifted to explicit involvement with the feminist movement, especially the left-wing elements of the feminist movement following the war. So Voice of Women was mentioned, Congress of Canadian Women, very much socialist feminist in their orientation. But many of the women expressed that they felt that while activities were welcome here in the hall around the feminist movement, around women's rights, they still felt marginalized, and much of their activism took place outside the hall for many of these women. In fact, one went so far as to say when I interviewed her that the male leaders at the hall didn't really care if she went to women's marches or not. I mean, they would be happy to sort of hold that up as here's what our women are doing, but certainly in any form of broader support, they really didn't feel it was there.